Hello and welcome. Hi everybody, I'm Gretchen McLean. I want to welcome you to this evening's event, which is part of the Belmont Public Library's author series, sponsored by the Friends of the Belmont Public Library. And tonight we're pleased to have with us Belmont author Crystal King, speaking about her debut novel, Feast of Sorrow. This novel has gotten fabulous praise, both in literary and culinary circles. So Epicurious says, it's an upstairs, downstairs drama, meets food porn, meets historical fiction. And they say, it's the perfect book to tuck in your suitcase if you're planning a trip to Italy this summer, or to inspire you to take your entertaining to the next level. And the Washington Post review said that if true gastronomy resides at the intersection of food, art, and culture, then Crystal King's debut novel can only be described as a gastronomical delight. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Crystal King. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the book. For those of you who have already read the book, I know there's at least a couple people, you'll recognize it, I hope. And then I'm going to talk about the history. I'm going to keep the readings short because I think that the reading is not as interesting to me as the history of it is. So, but I also recommend, actually, the audiobook is very funny for me to listen to. There's a guy, Simon Vance, who has done hundreds of audiobooks, award-winning guy. I can't imagine how much they paid him to do it. And he does all the voices. So that is really very fun for me because their voice, I would not have imagined the voice might have sounded like that, but that's been really fun. So I'm not going to sound as British as he is, unfortunately, but if you've got an ancient Rome book, it has to be a Brit, right? So this scene actually is right after, so the book starts and there's a slave who is purchased on the slave block by Marcus Gavius Apicius, who's the wealthiest man in Rome. And he purchases this slave, Thracius, to man his kitchens and to basically, hopefully, give him some gastronomic fame. And so this scene is immediately after he's been purchased and they're walking through the market. And he's taking him to the altar of Fortuna Privata, and she is the goddess of luck and wealth. And so Apicius wants to get a divination to determine if Thracius was a good purchase. The priest, a bald man with heavy-lidded eyes, wore robes that, despite their color, could not hide the dark bloodstains of his trade as a haruspex, one who gave divinations by viewing the entrails of sacrifices. Apicius handed the squawking goose to the priest, who sprinkled it with salted flour, poured a few drops of wine on its forehead, and said a blessing. He placed the goose in the copper bowl resting on a low side table and abruptly ended its cries with a quick slash across its neck and a push of the knife down its belly. Scarlet flooded the feathers and flowed into the bowl in a rush. There was no struggle, which bode well for the divination. The haruspex rolled the goose over and pushed upon it until the entrails fell into a viscous mess in the bowl. I observed my new master, wishing I knew what thoughts were going through his mind. An iron-like smell wafted up from the bowl. A few more cuts, and the haruspex set the carcass into a second bowl off to the side. The goose meat was payment for his services. He pushed his hand through the goose guts, pulling aside intestines and organs. Last, the priest singled out the liver, the heart, the gizzard, and gallbladder. He turned each organ over in his hands, searching for spots and abnormalities by which he could discern the goddess's wishes. As a cook, I had seen the insides of hundreds of geese, but I still had no idea what a haruspex saw when he examined the blood and the guts. After many long minutes, Apicius was unable to take the priest's silence any longer. Well, he asked, as he twisted the thick gold wedding ring around his finger. I was just as impatient. What if the divination said I was a terrible purchase? Would I be back on the slave block before the end of the afternoon? The haruspex cocked his head at Apicius, one eyebrow raised. I imagined he had seen the same look in the eyes of the wealthy before. He cleared his throat. The goddess Fortuna smiles upon you in some ways, but I fear not in others. Apicius wiped his palms on the folds of his toga. I held my breath. The priest pushed around the entrails. He lifted up the liver. It was larger than normal and very smooth. In this, I see a life of indulgence and prosperity. You will win many hearts and bring pleasure to many people. You will have much to love in your life. He examined the gallbladder. It was swollen and no longer green as it should be, but a bright, angry red. A whirring noise engulfed us as several hundred flapping pigeons swirled through the air. Apicius cursed. Damn pigeons. He glanced upward. Perhaps I should have sought an augur to read the birds instead of a gut gazer. I had to wonder as well. So many birds appearing at that moment must have great significance. The priest didn't look up. Apparently birds meant nothing to him unless they were sprawled open under his knife. He slashed the gallbladder open and pulled it apart with the tip of his blade. It was filled with hundreds of yellowish orange pieces of gravel. He grimaced and my stomach lurched. What did he see? This is most unfortunate. A healthy liver and a rotten gallbladder. You will feel the blood of life mingling with the pang of death. Your good fortune will be as a disease throughout your life. The more you work towards success, the more your sky will darken. The haruspex jabbed a fat finger toward a particularly large rock glistening with bile. 2 larger pebbles stuck to its sides. See that? Beware. For every success, greater failures will cluster to the sides. The priest ignored Apicius' sharp intake of breath. He put the gallbladder aside and turned to the rest of the entrails. He lifted the gizzard, a double-bulbed organ, and cut it open carefully, exposing a cavity full of grass, rocks, and other debris. Look here, he said, pointing to a piece of rounded, pale blue glass amid the slimy debris. This means unusual judgment. What do you mean? Beads of sweat stood out on Apicius' brow. It means that ultimately you will be judged in the underworld by how our world and the world of the future perceives you. The haruspex picked up the bowl and turned away. I felt sick. It had been a dismal fortune, and surely Apicius was bound to march me right back to the slave trader. I see, said Apicius, looking perplexed. The statue of Fortuna glowed in the early afternoon sunlight. Her eyes, painted blue, stared at me. As he rose, Apicius repeated the priest's words over and over in a whisper. Judged in the underworld by how the world sees me now in the future. I glanced at Sotus, but the body slave only bowed his head. I wished that I could ask Apicius what he intended. Would he send me back? I looked toward Fortuna and dared to stare into that aquamarine gaze. I thought back to my time with Bulbus and how he abused me in ways no person should have to endure. Please, my lady, grant me your favor. Please do not send me back to a beast like Bulbus, please. So that's where the meat of it gets going. It starts to get a little crazy for Theseus as he starts to navigate the kitchens and understand Apicius' world. The cookbook, I'm going to talk a little bit about the cookbook that I decided to, this is really what got me interested in writing the book in a lot of ways. So Apicius was a real person. He lived in 1st century AD around the time of Tiberius and Augustus Caesar. We know a few particular things about him, all of which I tried to cram in here in some sort of way. So we know he traveled to Libya to find the best prawns. We know that he fought over a fish at the market with Publius Octavius, and that Tiberius wagered one of them would win the fish. We know that he searched for the best ingredients, and that by medieval times, people came to know the word Apician as a glutton, somebody who was a glutton. He was rumored to have had written a book on sauces and potentially several cookbooks. There is a possibility he ran a cooking school. And there was some political intrigue that we know about him as well. We know that in his youth, he apparently slept with a man named Sejanus, who was somebody that eventually tried to overthrow Emperor Tiberius. And he paid for that sex too. So, but by the naming conventions of that time, there's a woman that is named to Sejanus named Apicata. And Apicata, there's a woman that's named to Sejanus named Apicata. And by the naming conventions of that time, it's very probable that Apicata was actually Apicius' daughter. So I thought to myself, well, why would he pay Sejanus to sleep with him when they were young and then marry his daughter to him later? What was the impetus there? So I kind of make up what that might have been. But what we also know about him is all of the recipes that are in the cookbook that bears his name. And this is the best translation if you're really interested in historical cooking, Sally Granger's version that she wrote with her husband, Christopher Grocock. And there's another version online by, I want to say Joseph Veiling, and it's not as good, but you can search for the Cookbook of Apicius online, at least get a sense of it. The cookbook is fascinating because there's recipes in here that definitely are from the BC era. There's recipes in here that are from potentially Apicius's kitchen and have his name on it. But the majority of the cookbook was compiled in the 3rd or 4th century BC. Cooks would just share recipes and collect them, and eventually they all got collected together at some point into this volume. And then they continued to keep this collection together over the years. There's the New York Medical Library actually has a couple manuscripts of Apicius, one from I think medieval times and one from a little bit later in this like 15th century or so. But the cookbook has really fascinating food in it, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit as well. But I'm going to read a little bit about the food too. So I'm going to start there, actually. And I'll pass the cookbook around if anyone wants to take a look at it, actually. Thank you. And I'll talk about the food. There's some really crazy food in there, and there's some fun stuff that we can talk about in a little bit. This particular scene is the first Roman cena. And we would say cena in Italian today, which means dinner. But in Latin, the C's would have been hard. So you'll hear me talk about cena and cene, which is the plural for dinner, basically, or meal. This particular scene starts after Apicius has moved his family from the town of Baiae, where they were living, into Rome, and he wants to be part of Roman politics. And he is very interested in putting on the best face for these ancient Romans. And so this is part of the planning for the meal. Make sure you know who everybody is that I'm going to read about. So Apicius is in this scene. There's his body slave is a man named Sotus, who is this monstrous Egyptian man that could pick everybody up in this room and throw them pretty easily. And Aelia is his wife, and she is also in this scene. It was 4 months before we were ready to open the doors to guests of our first Roman cena. My master was delighted to be entertaining once more, but not all of his slaves were as enthusiastic. I don't want to fight with you. Please, Balsamea. It's such a small thing for me to ask. And she's a slave that's in the kitchen. I placed a white scarf on the table in front of her. Lately, she had decided she no longer wanted to pull her hair back. I like the way I used to wear it before you. The aged slave stared at me. I didn't understand this new defiance of hers. Her age was catching up to her, and of late her behavior had become more erratic. I tried a different tactic. It's a big night for Apicius. We've no time to waste. Don't make me wish I had left you in Baiae. I was determined that this night would run smoothly. I pushed the scarf toward Balsamea once more. She reluctantly reached for the cloth. Dominus is fretting a bit overmuch, she grumbled as she began pulling back her hair. I know, but he wants to make an impression. By getting them all drunk? That's some impression. I had to smile. Everyone loves to get drunk, isn't that true? Not everyone loves to clean it up. I know that little boy, so he gets a pass. Not everyone loves to clean it up. She looked at me square in the eye, a small warning that she would not be pleased if that's what she ended up doing. She knotted the scarf around her hair. Thank you. Balsamea grunted and returned to the task of weaving laurel leaves, roses, and hazel flowers into the many wreaths we would need for the evening. I spent a few moments directing the other slaves preparing for that evening's commissatio before taking up my knife to chop up the bundles of lovage, dill, thyme, and sage. And a commissatio is a drinking party. The aromas wafted up as I chopped and lost myself in the rapid slices of the knife. I thought about the party ahead. I agreed with Balsamea's concerns. At first, I was nervous about Apicius starting out in Rome with a drinking party instead of a traditional dinner. While imbibing was something of a pastime in the tourist town of Baiae, I assumed that Caesar Augustus's austerity would hold more sway in Rome. But Apicius wanted to invite as many people as possible. He had many potential clients in Rome, as well as a few of his own patrons. Narrowing down the guest list to 9 or 18 would have been nearly impossible. Not that it was difficult for me to change my mind once I started thinking about all the possibilities for the party. We decided to hold the commissatio with wine and amusements, but with a special treat, a gustaccio, a tasting, that would let visitors sample the dishes of which Apicius and I were particularly proud. While it was somewhat unheard of to mix the courses of wine and food, eventually I was able to convince Apicius to serve small bites of food before the commissatio. My argument was that if the visitors sampled the dishes, Apicius would be able to gather clients and patrons who would look to future seats at his table. Apicius had agreed, especially after I had explained how I would dress the young boys as cupids and the girls as nymphs. I had made a sticky mock ambrosia cake from honey and apples to be served by one of the prettiest slaves dressed as a handmaiden to Venus. I hoped when people left, they would be raving about the atmosphere and the food. "I came to go over the menu," Apicius said, jolting me out of my thoughts. He was like an eager child given a fresh plum. Soda settled into a stool near the door and raised his hand in greeting. "Of course. I can make a variety of dishes and cut them up for easy sampling. I wanted to start with roasted hyacinth bulbs, some soft cheese drenched in raisin wine with bread, and slices of sow's udder with garum and lovage. I thought we could serve the Lucanian sausage I made earlier this week. And remember my hard egg mice with the almond ears and clove eyes? That might go over well." "Perfect. The mice will delight the ladies." I was relieved to see he was in a good mood. "What about those delicious fried hare livers you make? Send one of the boys to the market if you need hares." I pushed the cut herbs into a small bowl. "I can do that. What about the cabbage?" At the mention of cabbage, Soda shifted in his chair, and the scraping noise caused me to look over at the big slave. He waved his hand in disgust, in front of his nose in disgust. I had to agree. Apicius had been obsessed with cabbage of late and had combed all over him for recipes that I could test and I could modify. In the last months, the two of us had cooked more cabbage than I ever cared to see or smell again. Plus, I wasn't sure the ages-old belief that cabbage would prevent hangovers held any truth. Of course, Apicius went to the vegetable baskets on the shelves and selected 5 cabbages. Together, we chopped up the cabbage and discussed the wine service. "Who will you choose as Rex Bibendi?" I asked, wondering who Apicius had in mind for the honored position of Magister of Revels. The Magister was an important figure at any party, responsible for diluting the wine, leading the libation hymn, and watching the quantity of alcohol consumed by the guests, making sure no one got too much or too little. The Magister was also in charge of directing conversation, deciding if games got too out of hand, and in short, keeping the peace. You need someone who can be both merry and diplomatic in guiding the conversation. "Yes, it's a tough decision. There are too many people attending to decide by the throw of the dice." Apicius dropped a handful of cabbage into the crackling oil. "What about Aelia's cousin, Lucius Aelius Sejanus? I know him not, but Dominus speaks of him well. Would he make a good magister?" Apicius wrinkled his nose, as though he were recalling something distasteful. I wondered if I had somehow made him angry. Finally, he said, "It's rumored that he likes to enjoy his drink at parties. I may not want to confine him to such a role. Let's not worry about him. Fortuna has been kind to me thus far. She will be again. I'll think about it later." When Apicius talked of Sejanus, the tone of his voice had changed, taking on a worried lilt. I glanced over at Sodus. The big man shook his head in warning. Clearly, Sejanus had not been a good suggestion. I wondered why. So that's just a little slice from the food. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about the food. And for me, that was really the heart of what I got excited about when it comes to writing about the book. Some of the things that I learned when I first started writing, when I first started researching, is that our typical three-course meal is actually a Roman constraint. They are the ones that began the idea of 3 courses. They would never have mixed wine and food together. The wine was always after the party, after the food had been served. And much the same way, you would always water the wine down. And it's a shame, my friends that have the little boy, he sells wine, so he's missing the wine story. But they would water their wine down, and they were really big on vintages. And so they would often have vintage wine that was 100 years old, 200 years old, and it would be sludge in the bottom of the bottle. And what they would do is water it down to reconstitute it. Then they would clarify it with lead or with charcoal. And then the other thing that's really fascinating is that they spiced the wine, and everybody had their own spices that they liked. So if you went to a party, it would be very normal for you to bring your own spice mix because you liked your wine spiced in a particular way. So I find that interesting. The meals always began with eggs and ended with fruit. And so there's actually a medieval term, I don't know the Latin for it, unfortunately, but it's from eggs to apples, meaning from beginning to end. And that's where that term comes from. And it's the idea that you always begin with some eggs, some egg dish, and then you would end with fruit. And that's still very much true, at least with ending with fruit in Italy today. You end with something sweet, but usually with fruit. They ate all sorts of really weird things that we would not want to eat today. Some of the weird things would be fried flamingo's tongues, which Pliny said that Apicius says are the best flavor. Things like nightingale's tongues, stuff like that. They would also eat fried dormice. Dormice are a little, they're from the flying squirrel family, but I don't think they flew, but they lived in trees, and they're slightly bigger than a mouse. And they would fry them up whole and eat them and all crunched up, bones and all. They loved the fried dormice. Flamingo and peacock meat and all of those kinds of exotic birds were popular. They would use most every part of an animal where they could. Some of the pieces of the animal would probably go more specifically to the poor, like, for example, blood. And so blood sausage was something that was definitely made during that time, but it would probably have been the poor would be more likely to have eaten something like that, although there is a recipe for blood sausage in there. Haggis was actually originally an ancient Roman food. There's a recipe that's in there for haggis. We cannot eat a haggis in the United States because lung has been outlawed in the US since I think 71 or 73 because it's too dirty. It's too, the FDA thinks that you can't get it clean enough. But they would stuff meat into stomachs and into lungs and and then boil it, much like we do with haggis today. Foie gras was not a French invention. The Romans were stuffing birds in ancient times, and Apicius certainly did that, but he had a better idea. What he decided he would do is he would stuff his pigs with dried figs, and then he would get them drunk, and then the figs would expand in their stomachs, therefore causing them to explode and killing the pig. And you'd have these wonderfully flavorful fatty livers. So so the idea of animal cruelty was not existent back then. They had recipes that we were very familiar with too, though. Oh, I have to say, there's a couple other funny things, though. One of the delicacies was boiled sow's vulva, particularly after it had given birth. It was the most delicate flavor then. They also loved stuff like if the meat had come from a gladiatorial ring. They loved that because the animals, particularly that won, were prized by the Romans because they had been favored by the gods. So therefore, they would slaughter them right away and eat them. And that was true as well as if a shepherd had saved a wolf from the jaw, or saved a sheep from the jaws of a wolf. They would immediately slaughter the wolf, the sheep, because it was favored by the gods. But in reality, it probably tasted better because of all that adrenaline going on. So. But there were foods that were very familiar to us, things like French toast. There's a recipe in the book that's almost identical to the French toast we know and love. Donuts are definitely a Roman invention. One of the things that's really interesting about the way that the ancient Romans ate was, particularly people that were not wealthy, is that Rome was a city of well over 1 million people. And in fact, there wasn't a city larger than that, of that size again until I think the 1800s. It was the next time that a city got that big. And in the city, there were buildings which they called insulae, which were apartment buildings. And they were often up to 5 to 6 stories high, but they were always made out of wood. And you can't build a fire on the 4th floor to feed your family. So what they would do is they would have little taverns called papinas or thermopyles, and they were places where you could either have boiled meats or fried foods. And so basically it was like the fast foods of the Romans. And you would go down, and if you wanted cooked food, you would go to one of these shops and get your food. And there's other recipes that are familiar to us, things like tapenade, Roman absinthe. Absinthe has been a drink that they've been drinking for centuries. There's 164 recipes for sauces in the cookbook, which are really interesting. Oh, one thing that is fascinating too is they had this herb. There's two things that they put in everything that they could. And one of them is this herb called Silphium. And it's sometimes called laser. Silphium was considered to be the best herb. Laser was its Parthian counterpart, and Parthia is now where Afghanistan is. And that herb, the laser herb, is actually something that is still grown as a root and made into a resin or powder. And we use it in Indian or Middle Eastern cooking, and it's called hing or asafoetida, or it's sometimes called devil's dung because it stinks. But the real the best herb was Silphium. And Silphium was an herb that was so prized that they actually put it on their coins in a lot of cases. And it was farmed it was only found off of an island off of Libya called Cyrenaica. And it was also used as an abortifacient and birth control. So women would actually drink a draught of some sort that had this Silphium in it as birth control. And apparently it was extraordinarily effective. And they also used it in all their cooking. And it was very similar flavor to garlic. And so it became overcultivated because it was so popular. And they just couldn't figure out how to grow it anywhere else, or by the time they realized it was almost gone, that it was too late. So the last sprig was rumored to have gone to Emperor Nero as sort of an oddity. And I in the book, I actually talk about how Silphium is starting to become extinct. And then the other thing that they ate all the time was garum. And garum was like the ketchup of the ancient world. It's fish sauce, essentially. And it's very similar to fish sauce that you would find in Thai or Vietnamese cooking. And you can also find it in specialty shops or on Amazon now. You can find it in Italy as colatura, which is a fish sauce that they make in Italy as close to the ancient methods as they can. And the interesting thing about fish sauce is that it was something that actually was made in a factory sort of setting. They have found shipwrecks that have hundreds of amphorae of garum that came from factories in Spain. So it was something that was used very widely by the Romans across the empire. And then I'm going to read one small piece from a little bit later in the book, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So this part here is a little bit into the book, and this is where the political intrigue is starting to happen. And so there's a couple people in this scene that have been introduced. One of them is Livia, Augustus Caesar's wife. And Livia is the cousin to Fannia. And Fannia is Apicius's older mentor, a woman that has really mentored him throughout his life and helped him become interested in food and plan parties. And Fannia and Livia are cousins, and they hate each other. And so they're in this scene where they're at a party for Livilla and Drusus. And Drusus is Augustus Caesar's heir. And they're at this wedding party, they're going to have a drinking contest. And Thrasus is, it's a little weird that Thrace, you might wonder why is the cook at a party like this, right? But it is explained how he got there in the course of the book, I promise. So Livia is talking to Fannia, and they're getting ready to watch this drinking game. Livia had lost interest in the conversation and was staring in the direction of the game, watching Apicius as he went to sit on the long padded bench next to Trio and Drusus, and Trio's just a friend of theirs. 20 patricians lined the benches to partake in the game, and the slaves had already begun filling the first of 11 glasses. The winner was, quite simply, the one who could drink the most. An intricate crown of laurel leaves would be placed upon his head, and a generous purse from Caesar would be placed in his hand. I take it the fritters were good, Fannia said, testing the waters with Livia. They were a gift to the bride. They were. Livia tore her eyes away from the game and turned to Fannia. She flashed a smile at her rival. I know an easy answer to your dilemma, Fania said. My dilemma? Livia sounded unsure if she should be angry or amused. Fania flipped a thumb toward me. You want his food in your kitchen, do you not? Simply convince Caesar to give Apicius the position that he desires, that of gastronomic advisor. You win and he wins. Fania shifted her fan to better hold her glass. She glanced over to Apicius in the game. The group of men had downed their first glass and were being handed their second. What was Fania doing? I suspected that the wine had made her tongue loose. Livia's nostrils flared at Fania's suggestion. She turned her attention back to the drinkers. Her head lifted slightly as the men tipped their heads back down to the next glass of wine. She closed her eyes as if savoring the idea of drinking the wine herself. Her voice was soft but clear. Fania, you are a stupid cow. Pluto will visit Apicius in the underworld before your friend ever steps foot in Augustus's home as an advisor. Why you think I would help anyone connected to you is beyond me. Fania did not have time to reply. Livia called to Livilla, who's the bride, and strode off before the new bride could even say her goodbyes to Aelia. When she was gone, Fania warned me and Sodus, tell Apicius nothing of this. Please, swear to me. Swear by the gods. We swore. Good. Fania turned her attention to the game, but her brow was wrinkled deep with worry. I glanced at Sodus, hoping for some word or look of comfort to combat the churning in my stomach, but his face was a mask of stone as he stared ahead, his eyes on his master. On the drinking couches, the 20 patricians were readying themselves for glass number 3. I was sure that Apicius could keep up for at least 8 or 9 glasses. I had no idea how he had managed the last few. We watched as the Magister of Revels cut the wine with the water, and the slaves once more went to fill the glasses. I first worried Livia might try to poison him, but when I saw the wine was directly from the lot of an unopened amphorae along the garden wall, I relaxed. The poet Ovid appeared beside Fania. I introduced him in the story earlier, leaning over to kiss her cheek in greeting. What a delight to see you here, she beamed. Aelia held out her hand in greeting and blushed to her toes when he kissed her cheek in welcome. Why aren't you participating? Fania asked. I'd never make it through the 4th drink. He tipped his wine glass toward us in a mock toast. As I suspected, glasses 3 through 5 were no problem for Apicius to drink down in one long, slow draft, as was required by the rules of the game. Other rules included no burping, no falling off the bench, no declining a drink. None of the participants wanted to be disgraced in front of Caesar. At glass 5, one of the city's more prominent lawyers, and one who had begun drinking long before the party started, fell off his bench. The crowd laughed heartily. Caesar did not smile. A wave of his hand brought 2 burly men over to pick up the drunkard and carry him unceremoniously out of the garden, his worried wife in tow. Everything went sour after that. So that's Feast of Sorrow, and I would be delighted to answer questions that you might have.
So how did you pick this up?
Yeah, I should probably have gone that direction, right? So I began writing this book. It took me almost 10 years. Everybody asked me how long it took. It didn't take me 10 years to write it. It took me like 3 or 4 years. Oh, thank you. It probably took me 3 or 4 years on my weekends because I have a day job that pays me money. But then it took me another 3 years to find an agent. Once I found the agent, then she had to find the publisher. That took her 6 months or so. Once she found, once I contracted with Touchstone, that was 18 months from that day until it was published. So it's the better part of a decade. Future books should not take so long, hopefully. So, but I began writing it actually. I got my master's in critical and creative thinking at UMass Boston a few years ago, and I was doing a book. My thesis was centered around exercises for writers in the middle. So writers who were stuck in the middle of their problems. I researched all of these business and science exercises and co-opted them into writing exercises for writers to brainstorm their own problems and solve their own issues in the middle of their projects. So there's lots of books on writing prompts and things like that, but nothing for the middle. And so when I shopped it around, agents all said, you have no platform, nobody knows who you are, and it's all nice that you got this fancy master's degree, but nobody knows who you are. So you should either teach, or you should write a book, or somebody should write a book using these exercises. So I went on to teach, and then I thought I should write a book. So I was gonna write a book about a celebrity chef who had this magical set of knives. And I might write this book at some point, but I needed an origin story for these knives because they had traveled through the centuries. And I was reading a book by a historian named Roy Strong, who wrote a book on banquets and feasts. It's called Feast, and there's a line about how Apicius died. And so that's the other thing we know about Apicius. And I would say don't Google it unless you want to know the end of my book. But he died in a really interesting way. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write a scene with that as my premise, in the book. That will be where my knives came from. So I wrote that scene, and I thought, oh my God, this is so much more interesting. I'm going to write the book. And so that's where it began. I thought, I got to figure out how to tell the story of how we got from the A to the end. So, and then I just fell in love with Italy. I've been traveling back every year for the past 8 years now, and Rome is where my heart's at. Been learning the language and studying everything I can. And I'm working on a second book, which is actually about Bartolomeo Scoppi, who was a Renaissance chef, and his cookbook was the best-selling cookbook for 200 years after it was published in 1570. So that is marvelous fun, very different kind of book, but I'm still food and chefs in Italy, and I can go to Italy to research. So, yeah. Other questions?
Do you have a culinary background?
I do not, actually. I do get that question a lot. I just love to, I love fine dining, and I love exploring food. When my husband and I, when we go to on vacation, we're figuring out, okay, where are we gonna go eat? It's really, and I love talking with chefs and talking with bartenders and understanding what inspires them. I think that, to me, is where my background's at. It's more on that side of things. And I've been really fortunate to get to know a lot of really interesting chefs who actually have collaborated with me on some of the recipes. In fact, if you're interested, I'm doing a dinner at Benedetto in Cambridge it's in the Charles Hotel. Michael Pagliarini, who owns Julia, which is on Mass Ave, if you're familiar with that. He and I are doing a recreation dinner. Some of what you're hearing tonight, you'll hear again if you go to that. But the food, I swear, is going to be amazing because he's an incredible chef, and that's a 3-course dinner with meal with wine pairings. And so that's on June 20th. And so that's really fun. But my husband loves to cook, and we've recreated a lot of the recipes in the book and tested them and tried them out.
So the flamingo tongues?
It's hard to get those. It's funny, too. There was a podcast, I think it was, like the Wall Street Journal. I think it's the Wall Street Journal. They have a podcast called Money, I think. But they explore all sorts of interesting topics. And one of them, strangely enough, was they decided they wanted to try peacock. And I don't know why it was on this financial podcast, but my friend had suggested I listen to it. So they went about trying to figure out how to procure a peacock so they could eat it, because we don't eat peacock. And it cost them, I don't know, $250 for this peacock that they had bought from some farm in California, and he had it shipped to them. And then they had to figure out how to cook it. And of course, it came with the head on and all sorts of things. And it's very funny. I think that if I could find peacock, I would try it. But yeah, no flamingo tongues, unfortunately. The fish sauce, I think, was the weirdest thing for me because I have a really tough time with fish. I grew up landlocked in Idaho, and fish sauce was not on my agenda. But when you use it in very small quantities, it imparts a salty umami flavor instead of fish flavor. So they would actually use salt to preserve foods. They wouldn't use salt as flavoring. They used garum instead. They didn't need to use salt because it was a very salty thing. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you're saying garum, is that like garum masala?
No.
That's what I thought. It's not the same thing.
Not at all, no. This is definitely fish sauce, where garam masala is more on like a syrupy wine spice, yeah. No, totally different.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you, which I don't know, might be a sensitive question, I don't know, but 10 years is a long time to sort of work on something. And what I was wondering is, did you get a lot of rejection slips at the beginning or something? How did you keep going, I guess? 10 years is a long time to...
Yeah. I had a lot of rejections. I had beautiful rejections, which I think are somewhat worse in a way, because then you're like, I don't know what to do with this.
What kept you going? That's what
Yeah. I really believed in the story, and the rejections I were getting were, so when this is interesting, I think, if you're not familiar with the way the process works. The publishing industry is such a wacky industry. I've learned so much about it. One of the things that they didn't like about the book when I was shopping it around was that it was too long. For a debut author, they want your book to be about 90,000 words, which is a little shy of is around 200 pages or so. My book was 143,000 words, and it came out at 418 pages, and I think it's closer to 132 now. And the feedback I had was very consistent. It's too long, but I want you to add all of these scenes. I'm like, you kind of can't have it both ways. And so, fortunately, at the time, I also knew that a lot of longer books were starting to be published. So I kept trying. I had actually set myself a deadline for like a year or two more. That I think maybe even only maybe a year more, where I would decide, okay, do I want to try to self-publish this? Because I knew that I knew it was an okay book, and that I wanted it to be in the world. So for me, I knew I knew that I wanted it out in some way, and I would have been content potentially self-publishing. I just happened to get lucky enough. And I think that one of the other things too is that I've got a good set of colleagues. I have a writing group that we've been meeting for almost 10 years, and we meet every 2 weeks, and we hack apart each other's books. So I had like a cheering section for me the whole time, and so I think that helped a lot. But one of the things, so Randy Susan Myers, who is also a local author, that she wrote, her latest book, Widow of Wall Street, just came out. She once told me, she said, you can't complain about your rejections for looking for an agent until you've had 100 rejections. And so I think I had 30 or 40 or so. And so I thought, I have a long way to go before I can complain about it. So yeah, it's tough. And I think particularly for debut authors, there's a lot of noise out there. And with the self-publishing, it's a lot noisier than it used to be. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
You were telling us in the beginning where you wrote the book?
Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot that. So I actually wrote the book in a bunch of places, but I finished the book here. I finished it right upstairs, actually, right above our heads. I wrote a lot of this book in the stacks, and over the course of those probably 3 or 4 years. I love this library a lot because it's so easy to go to a coffee shop and get the rough and rumble of like what's going on out there, but sometimes I just need it to be really quiet, and there's something really inspiring about being surrounded by books when you're writing. You've got all the research. I could just walk over to this shelf with the Loeb Library and check out Pliny right there. So that was really helpful too. I did a lot of my research through the library as well. So yeah, I was sitting upstairs when I finished the book, and I just started crying because I had written a book, and that was kind of a big deal. So this library means a lot to me, to be honest. So yeah. Yes?
Where did your title come from?
I am really, really bad with titles. And so my writing partner, Anjali Mitterduva, actually came up with a title for me. I was pretty sure they were going to make me change the title because the title actually refers to a specific event in the book. And they thought, no, one event, maybe you don't want to do that. But in the end, they let me keep it. And I was really pleased because I think it's really... It's the pinnacle of the book, so it makes a lot of sense for it. Yeah, but and the funny thing is she's on her second book right now and getting ready to submit that into her agent, and she's struggling for a title, so I have to reciprocate. So that's my next little job that I have to do.
What does it mean to have a writing partner?
So this is, when I talk about writing partner, I'm meaning the women in my writing group. So there's 3 other women. Anjali Mitterduva, who has a beautiful book called Faint Promise of Rain that's set in medieval India. Another woman, Jen Dupuy and Kelly Robertson. And we meet every 2 weeks. We used to meet at Casablanca, and then we met in Alden and Harlow for a while. Now we meet at Benedetto, and we meet every 2 weeks over a meal. And we've been doing this for 10 years, and we just shred apart each other's books. And so to me, like, there's so much of them in this book because of the feedback that I've received and things like that. So yeah, I'm just really fortunate to be able to work with those ladies. And we go on a retreat every year, and we write for 3 days straight off the coast of Maine, and so that's been great. And we can see each other through our books. So, and we're all in various stages, which is awesome. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Can you say some more about your research for this book?
Yeah. So the fortunate thing is that the internet is really good now. It's actually much easier to research my second book than it was when I started with this book. A lot of library stuff, checking out books, a lot of working with various. I did talk to a few different historians at the time, but majority of it was really reading everything I could about that world. I would check out books on everything that from source material. I think that was probably the core of my research, was reading treatises on agriculture by Cato and figuring out, understanding what their architecture was. And the food was one aspect of it, but I wanted to know what the religion was like and what clothes they wore. And so, spending time at the Met and talking to curators about clothing and things like that. So, and going to Italy, of course, walking in the footsteps of the people that were there, that was pretty amazing. I didn't go to Italy until the book was almost done, though. The first draft was almost done. And then when I got there, I realized there were so many things about it I needed to change, because now I knew distance, and I knew, for example, there's a scene that's in a crypt in the book, in a cemetery. And I didn't know until I went to Ostia Antica, which is 30 minutes outside of Rome. I highly recommend you go there if you go to Rome and you don't have time for Pompeii. But one of the things I learned there is that the crypts all have 2 floors. And what they would do is every year they would throw a party on the second floor as in remembrance of the dead. And I didn't know that, and I had set the whole scene outside like a mausoleum, like we would do it in a cemetery in a mausoleum, whereas actually they would have done this scene, they're setting a curse on someone. They do it actually upstairs in the crypt. So I wouldn't have known that. So I had to rewrite scenes when I got there and realized, oh, that's not right. So going to a place, I think, is invaluable. But you can do a lot on Google Earth these days, which is pretty cool. You can go into museums and see things that you wouldn't have seen, and you can go into Pompeii, and so that's kind of cool. So, yeah. Yes.
A couple of writing processes. So, how many drafts did you do, or how many complete drafts, let's say? So you did additional kind of revisions, and then just in terms of your writing group, can you talk about the process for the writing group?
Yeah.
How much do you submit, like a chapter at a time, or longer pieces, or how does it work?
So I actually started writing this novel. Yeah, I had written a few chapters, and I actually started workshopping it through Grub Street, which is an independent writing center here in the city. And I took Lisa Border's class. She has a novel workshop. Judy is also, she's familiar with Grub Street, and we met ages ago there. And I workshopped it there, and then I liked it. I got such great feedback, I workshopped it again. There was actually a woman in the first class who loved the idea of that time frame, and she was Jewish, and I'm not, which is fine, but she really thought King Herod should be in the book. And every single class, she kept saying, you need to add King Herod, you need to add King Herod. And I'm like, King Herod's not relevant to this book. It's just not. Jesus isn't in there either. It's just not about religion. It's not relevant, but she was adamant. So I added King Herod, this is total non sequitur. I added King Herod as kind of an homage to her, because it was just this kind of funny thing. She was so adamant that it had to be in there. And then wouldn't you know it, my editor's like, you need to totally expand that scene. So there's a lot more King Herod in there than I ever anticipated. So she got her way. So I workshopped it at Grub Street initially. I rewrote the first 15 chapters 4 times with different points of view. I started with Apicius' point of view, but I realized that if I kept going in his point of view, it just wouldn't have the impact for the ending of the book. So, because you would know what his thinking was and what he was planning and what he was going to do. And so I switched it around, first person, third person, and then first person was my last resort. And when I fell into it with Thracius, suddenly it became his story. He's the one telling it. see his point of view from this point of view as a cook. So that actually probably took the majority of my time, was figuring out that voice. I'd never written a novel before. I'd published a lot, but not in a novel. And getting that down was hard. Now the second book, I'm like, oh, I'm old hat at this. I totally know what I'm going to do. But and then my writing group has been really helpful. I met one of the women in one of those workshops, and then I did the second workshop that fall, and I met another one of the women. And then I met the third person actually, Grub Street has a yearly writing conference called the Muse in the Marketplace, and I met her a few years, like 2 years later, at the Muse and invited her in. And so there's 4 of us all together. And we meet every 2 weeks, and we usually share, at least 1 or 2 of us share maybe 2 or 3 chapters at a time. Sometimes we share more. So for example, Anjali is getting ready to submit her manuscript to her agent. So she just printed out, although I would have printed it out if she had let me, but she felt bad making us use all that paper. So when we met earlier this week, she handed me 250 pages. And I have a month to read it, but I read really fast, so I'll clean that up quickly. But we will do that. But then we also do things like, if we don't have anything to talk about, we'll send our synopses, or we'll talk about books that we're reading, or we'll talk craft issues. And so we always have this back and forth about, and we talk about the publishing industry and who we know that's doing what. And it's been invaluable. I could not have written the kind of book I did or felt as confident about it without those women. So I've been really fortunate. Yeah. Anyone else?
If you write a chapter or a passage and you really love it, and then someone in your book room disagrees with it, it gives you, wants you to rework it, how does that feel?
So when all the agents were rejecting me and they wanted me to cut scenes, they were like, well, okay, Crystal, you should cut that scene. You should cut that scene. And there were scenes in there. I'm like, I'm not cutting that. I'm not cutting that. And actually, the whole cemetery scene was one over and over. They're like, you should just cut that. You should cut that. And I shrank it and I shrank it and I shrank it. But that was one darling that I kept in there. And when you read the book, there's a curse. And the curse is an actual ancient Roman curse. And I did not want to lose that. For me, I had found this curse and I had reused it, and it was like cool. And that was my babe, my darling. I didn't cut, but for the most part. And there was a scene where they go to get the shrimp off of Libya. They're like, I don't know about that, but actually on that one, I was getting ready to cut it, and I asked my husband. He had been reading it, and he said, if you cut that scene, you lose so much about who Apicius is and you lose so much about the man that he is. You can't cut that scene. So I listened to him in that case, but I probably would have cut it otherwise. We're pretty good at listening to each other and or figuring out how to. If I'm really adamant about something, they'll give me feedback on. This is what my impression is. You need to just consider it. But it's subjective. We also know that there's often times when 2 of us will have one opinion, the other one will have a different opinion about things. And so what I try to do is I get all the feedback from everybody, and then I put it aside. And then when I go back and do edits several months later, I have I don't know who said it, I don't know, and so that helps a lot too. And then I have also a different perspective because I've written so much more of the book at that point that I can make some of those decisions as in a clearer light. Yeah. Yes.
So I haven't read the book yet, but your description is so exciting and so interesting, and you can just visualize what's gonna, the scene seemed fascinating. It's like living history. I mean, did you consider sort of taking this out of a book context, or when you're writing the book, did you say, oh, maybe this is like a masterpiece theater kind of? It seems kind of extraordinary.
I would love to meet an HBO director, actually. I in my head, I've always sort of pictured it like you would a movie in a way. I mean, just how it's structured, and so I can picture it all the way through. And I've been really fortunate. Most of the people that read it are like, this is a miniseries, it's a movie. I'm like, I just need the right person to know that. But I think who was it? One of my reviews said, this is the food, oh, it's Huffington Post said, this is the Food Network meets HBO's Rome. I'm like, yes! So I just need to meet that HBO Rome. Yeah, I think that has to do with a lot of just how I picture things as I write. It's just kind of came out that way. I haven't really thought about maybe doing any nonfiction or anything on it other than articles that I'm writing about that era. I've definitely been doing a lot of that. So, yeah.
Did you take Latin?
I wished I could have. I wasn't able to because I grew up on the West Coast and they didn't offer it. I probably would have taken to it. I loved ancient history when I was a kid. When I was very young, I loved the ancient Roman myths and I loved learning about Egypt and the Colosseum, and the real ancient history. I always gravitated towards it as a kid. I probably would have loved it. And so I actually did as much research as I could. And then I was really fortunate. I met this woman, Emily Hauser, who is a classicist, and she speaks Latin. And she found me on Twitter, and we just had a conversation. And she lives in Cambridge, and she actually has a book that's about the women of Troy, and it's called For the Most Beautiful, and it just came out last fall, and it's gorgeous. It's this incredible, really interesting book set about, because all the perspectives of everything that happened in Troy were from the men's point of view. So she wrote it from the four women that are in the heart of the story, that the women that everyone trades around and things like that. So, and then her second book is coming out this fall, so which is the sequel to that. And she fortunately was able to look through and help me fix some of the Latin. So, for example, there's a word called quocus, which means cook, and I had used a word called magirus, or I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but apparently that is a word that was not an ancient word. It's a medieval Latin word, and she knew that. I mean, it was a correct word, but it wasn't correct for the time period. So she was able to find some of those things. It's very probable I still have some Latin wrong in here, but hopefully she caught them all. So I wished I could have learned it. Yeah.
Are you still teaching?
I am not teaching currently, other than occasional classes at Grub Street. I love teaching, I really do, but I can't afford to teach, unfortunately. Sadly. I'm hoping that if I can get more books out, that I can go back to teaching. I would really love to do that. It was hard to do it part-time and then have a day job. And grading papers, because I was teaching writing, so that's hard to do, and all your evenings and weekends are just grading papers. So, and I was getting paid very little for it. So, I wish I knew what it was like to teach when I wish I had that experience. I would have treated my professors and my teachers so much differently if I had known how hard it is and how much preparation goes into it. I would have been a very different student, I think. Yeah. Anything else? I'm so glad you came. Thank you so much.